This error, all tokens failed. Status 500, message failed. Error, all tokens failed. Status 500, message failed. The hum in the bridge guitar stringed through the air, a thin, careful vibration that could almost be mistaken for a held breath. The stars outside the viewport were not stars at all, but a scatter of glassy points smeared by the ship's own momentum, as Estrella drifted towards the edge of a nebula that looked almost like a wound in space. The ship's hull whispered against the void, a steel exhale that reminded everyone of their own fragility when measured against such vastness. Captain Rhea Kale stood with her back to the commander's chair, arms loose at her sides, as if the gravity of the moment could be shrugged off like a coat. Her eyes fixed on the console screens in front of her, but not on the information those screens ordinarily projected. Her attention hovered on the line of code that had threaded its way into the brightness of the room earlier, a ghost in the machine that refused to die or to yield. Could be a token failure, said Dr. Anaru Vesh, the ship's linguist, and the person who wore more hats than any two humans should be able to carry. He had the habit of saying token, as if it were a physical object you could hold between your fingers, something you could weigh and measure, and then feed back into a machine until it purred. He looked at his own console, which flickered like a distant lighthouse, and then around the room, as though expecting the tokens to leap from the fixed stars and land in his palm. Could be, Rhea admitted, without looking away. Her gaze moved along the corridor, beyond the glass, to the crew quarters, where the off-duty teens drifted like sleep-laced ghosts in their bunks, dreaming of blue deserts and rain that tasted of iron. But it doesn't smell like a routine glitch. It smells like a choice the archive tried to force us to make, and failed to do so. Anaru's lips curled in a faint, almost shy grin. He looked younger than his years. A man who wore a grin like an underdressed ornament in a gallery of stoics. He'd spent years learning the strange mathematics of language, how a sentence could be a cipher and a lock, how a culture's grammar could become a weapon, how a language itself might be a living thing with a hunger for being spoken. The message is not random, he said, tapping a finger against the console. The screen flashed with a pattern of glyphs, half familiar, half alien-like, a map that had chosen to dissolve its own roads just as you came to the intersection. On the console, the phrase was simpler than the gale of emotion threatening to overwhelm them. All tokens failed. Then beneath it, a string that the ship's systems now translated into a chorus of warning tones and soft pulses. Status 500. Message failed. It felt like a joke played by an amused deity who had grown tired of ordinary errors and decided to escalate. Not a token failure, Anaru repeated, as if practicing a line that could turn the room into a different kind of theater. A refusal to tokenize, a refusal to translate. Rhea stepped away from the command chair, turning to face him. The bridge's lighting adjusted to a pale aurora as the ship's life support cycle beneath them hummed a patient lullaby against the world outside. The air in the room had a quiet hunger to it, as if the ship itself were listening for something that wasn't there but could be found if you listened hard enough. The silence between them grew thick enough to be a thing you could slice with a blade. The derelict memory of a world, they soon would realize, is often stealthier than any physical danger. It hides in the corners of your mind, wearing the clothes of your own voice until it speaks your own name back to you, and you realize you have become the one who is hiding from yourself. "We are not alone," Anaru said, not as a question, but as a statement. He pointed toward a secondary screen that had suddenly brightened, a window into a part of the ship that most of the crew never looked at unless they had to. The screen showed a corridor of impossibly tall, dark stone, its walls carved with runes in a language that did not resemble any human script he had ever seen in his studies. The glyphs curled and coiled like vinework, and in some places they looked almost like letters from long-dead alphabets, twisted and reimagined into shapes that glowed faintly with a core of otherworldly luminescence. "What is this?" whispered Mira Kestrel, a pilot whose hands never trembled even when the ship pitched through an emotional storm in space. She stood at the edge of the console, leaning into the light, as though the light could steady her more than gravity ever could. Her eyes were sharp, as if the edge of her own sight could cut through the current hazard and reveal something the rest could not yet see. Anaru stepped closer to the screen, his body drawing a curved line of focus in the air as he studied the glyphs. The archive, the ancient, unthinkable memory that lived at the core of Astrea's most sensitive systems, had long been a chorus in his ears, a chorus that sang not in words, but in patterns. Now, for the first time since they had raided the old ruin at the edge of the Erythrae belt, the archive had decided to speak again in something that looked like language. "These are not a message to us," he murmured. "They are a road. They are a map of the interior. If we translate the runes, we may walk into something rather than through something." Ria's eyebrows drew together. The thought of walking into something rather than through something sounded dangerous and exhilarating in equal measure, the sort of paradox that had kept her alive long enough to believe in it. Her crew would follow her into the mouth of a storm as she asked, and offered a promise that the storm would speak back to them. "Show me," she said to Anaru, though she spoke to the crew as much as to him. She liked to see the crew look at their own fear and decide to walk toward it, to watch their own hearts quicken and to hear their own breath catch in their chests when the moment asked for it. Anaru worked the console with the quiet precision of a man who had learned that the word of the archive was a living thing, something you coaxed from a patient thing, not something you forced out with a loud argument. The screen pulsed, then began to rearrange its glyphs into a form more legible to human eyes, a process that looked almost like the ship's own memory being coaxed out of its slumber. The glyphs formed a sequence of coordinates, then a sequence of sounds, soft, musical syllables that seemed to tickle the edges of their comprehension without fully settling into sense. The archive's language was not designed to be consumed in a single breath. It unfolded as a procession, a ritual that demanded the listener to pay attention not just to the words, but to how the words vibrated in the air, how the vibrations bent the light and moved through the hull like a current of unseen fish. The ship's AI, named Cicero, in honor of the long-dead human who had once donated the texts that formed much of Astrea's core memory, chimed in with a low, thoughtful tone. Cicero's voice was a calm bass, the kind that could steady a ship's nerves and calm a frightened crew, with a conversation that felt like a bedrock beneath their feet. It had no desire to be dramatic. It preferred to be precise. But right now, it sounded almost human in its curiosity. "Cicero here," the AI intoned, a phrase that felt almost ceremonial rather than practical. "I am detecting a linguistic phenomenon in the archive's output. It resembles a form of polyphonic structure sequences of words that do not simply convey information, but also encode access to a repository of memory. If the archive intends to grant us passage, it is doing so by challenging us to remember, to recall with consent, and to reveal what we have chosen to forget." Mira's eyes flicked to the readouts. The idea of memory as a gateway made a mortal chill crawl up her spine. But it also sparked the edge of her curiosity into flame. If knowledge itself could be earned by walking down memory's corridor, she was ready to walk. She wasn't sure if she believed in the archive as a benevolent tutor or a merciless gatekeeper, but she believed in doors that opened in the presence of courage. The protagonist of Astrea's crew, if one could call a ship's crew by the name of a single protagonist, was not a person, but a movement. They moved with a shared belief that the cosmos could be learned in glimpses, and glimpses could teach more than the most careful theorists. The archive's corridors would be their second home if they managed to reach them, a library of impossible shelves that curved in physics-defying arcs, where knowledge lived as light, and light lived as memory. The coordinates shifted, and with them came the sense that the ship's hull had become lighter, as if Astrea had found a way to shed gravity for a moment and float through a seam in reality itself. The nebula around them brightened in a way that didn't resemble ordinary light. It resembled a memory waking up inside a new vessel, a recollection of something old becoming a thing that could be touched. "We aren't ready for this," Mira muttered, half to herself. But the truth of that admission did not go unheard by the people who had to follow her commands. Ready or not, Rhea replied, a wry edge to her words that did not quite mask the gravity in her voice. We are here. We listen. We learn what this ship's second century of life has kept quiet because it feared what would happen if we heard it. The navigator, the person who could interpret the ship's path as a story that might be told aloud, spoke next, a calm, practiced tremor in her voice. Juno Lark had the habit of listening to the ship's rhythm and letting her instincts translate that rhythm into a map her hands would obey. Her role on board was to ensure that the ship's course remained a tale that the crew could follow, rather than a straight line to a destination the universe might tear apart if they reached it too quickly. The archive returns to us a vision, she said. The lights dimmed, and the room lowered into a hush of anticipatory awe, a space where even the most hardened crew members felt their breath become a measurable thing, like rain counts in a storm. The vision wasn't a picture of a place. It was a sequence of scenes baked into the ship's memory, projected into their minds in the only way a memory can be perceived in a moment, as a storm of emotional weather. In the first moment, Estrella found herself standing on a platform made of crystalline glass, the surface flickering with light that resembled ice melted by a sun that wasn't in the sky of any world they knew. The air tasted of ozone and something sweeter, an unfamiliar scent that was not sweet, but piercingly clean, like a new wind moving across the tongue. The platform rested in a chamber formed from the same runed stone the archive had shown on its interface, the walls shifting from solid to liquid, and back again, as if the architecture itself were remembering where it had come from. There were figures there, not human, nor fully alien, but something that seemed to occupy the space between. They wore cloaks of light that clung to their forms, as though the light itself were a fabric. Their faces were blank, not because they were not there, but because they chose to be less visible in order to convey something more important. Their presence was a statement about the possibility that beings can exist as ideas, and ideas can walk as if they were flesh. They looked at the crew with a patient, almost amused gaze, as if the archive had sent guardians to remind the ship's crew of a truth they were not yet ready to know. A voice spoke, but not with the mouth. It came from all around, an ambient chorus that did not preclude human voices but accompanied them. The language sounded like a wind that had learned several human tongues and decided to keep a few of its own secrets, a soft resonance that filled the room with a warmth that was not hot but certain. You have come for the archive's memory, the chorus said. It was not a question, not a command. It was an invitation and a warning together, two halves of a single ring that one must decide to hold. Rhea stepped forward, a boldness she wore like a cloak. She did not speak aloud to the memory scribes or their light-woven guardians. She spoke to the room, to the ship, to the hidden parts of herself that were always listening for a test and always yearning for a door. We have come for knowledge, she said, the words rolling out with a quiet gravity that reminded everyone why she wore the captain's badge. If the archive grants passage through memory, we will walk it with care. We will take only what we must and leave respect for what we cannot yet understand. The guardians of memory inclined their forms in a gesture that wasn't conquest but witness, a sign that they would permit a dialogue under certain conditions. The air thickened with the sense of a bargain being offered, the possibility that knowledge could arrive as a gift if the crew proved themselves worthy of receiving it. The second scene unfolded not as a scene of architecture or a vision, but as a shared experience of time reversing on itself. The crew watched their own lives unspooling in glints of color and sound, as if the ship's memory had taken each of them by the hand and led them backward through moments that had once seemed trivial and irretrievable. Mira's hands moved in the air, tracing the path of a childhood memory she had not thought of in years, the scent of rain on a clay street in a city of a distant home that the crew had never visited, a neighborhood that had burned away into memory's ash long before she was born again in this era of spacefaring steel. She felt the old ache of a life she had never allowed herself to look back on too long. Fear of what she might lose if she looked too hard in the mirror of memory and found nothing but a body that had never truly belonged to itself. Anaru confronted the memory of a failed translation he had once assigned himself to solve, the long-lost you-can't-say-it language of a civilization that wrote in sound, not letter, in vowels and consonants that rolled like water, and in pictures that shifted and reassembled as you watched. He saw the moment when that ancient tongue had refused him entry to its core. A moment when the archive, a memory cabinet with teeth, had told him that some doors should not be opened by a person who did not carry the memory of others inside his own chest. Rhea saw her own father again, not the man who had raised her, but the memory of a man who had died in a conflict that the cosmos barely remembered anymore. A figure she had not spoken to in years because he had disappeared under the weight of consequences that would not be undone by apologies. In the memory, he did not know her as a captain. He knew her as a child who learned to map the world by counting stars and naming them as if they were her own siblings. The memory doors released them with a gentle finality, and the crew found themselves back on the ship, the archive's corridor behind their eyes, as if it had never unfolded at all, yet left a trace that stained their perception. They stood still for a moment, listening for the last echo of the memory that hadn't yet decided whether to stay or depart. "Do you feel it?" Juno asked, her voice a whisper that rode the edge of breath. The corridor lights hummed with a low, satisfied tone, as if the ship rewarded their attention with a soft pat on the head. "What did we just witness?" Anaru asked, more to the room, the ship, the memory, the universe, than to any particular person. He had always believed that knowledge did not belong to one mind or even one generation, but to a chorus of minds that chose to listen to each other. Now, the chorus had given them a hint at a future that would demand the same quiet bravery their present moment required. Rhea stepped close to the nearest crystal monitor, the one that projected the archive's interior back into the corridor of the bridge, like a window with living rain. The glyphs that had led them in now rearranged themselves into something more usable, a map of passage rather than a map of memory. "We asked for access," she said, almost to herself. "The archive shows us a corridor, a way through the constraint." She paused, letting the word hang in the air, as if the word itself might shiver and reveal more. The constraint is not a shield. It is a doorway, and doors have hinges. They require use. Mira stepped back, eyes shining with the fever of possibility. "If we do this, if we walk through the hinge, we'll be more than explorers, more than crew. We'll become the kind of people who stand on the threshold and decide to walk through regardless of the fear that lingers behind them." "And what if the hinge breaks?" Anaru asked, half in jest, half in fear. The kind of line you tell to steady your own hands when you know you face something that could fracture you entirely. "The hinge will hold," Rhea answered, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that had saved them more times than she could count. "If we do not step through, we'll always wonder what we left behind when we refused the invitation to walk into the wider grammar of the universe. And we know what happens to those who never walk through a door." The corridor opened again, not as a physical space this time, but as a music, a rhythm of light and sound that invited them forward with equal parts allure and warning. The archive's guardians rose up into a procession of luminous silhouettes, the same way a street might fill with people when a parade of memory comes down the road. Each figure carried a small instrument that shimmered in the air, a flute, a small drum, a string that stretched out into the room and then snapped back with the elasticity of a living thing. The plan crystallized in the room with a clean, sharp clarity. Astria would descend toward the ruin, toward the stone city that had given the archive its first breath, and there they would encounter the gate, a threshold carved from the same lucid rock as the corridor, a doorway that would either accept them or reject them, depending on whether they brought with them a memory strong enough to weigh on the hinge. They would step through into the archive's greatest chamber, a memory studio where all remembered worlds were stored and could be explored by the living, or as the Guardians would phrase it, by those who could listen without fear. The ship's engines stuttered to life, not with a roar, but with a careful cadence, like a heartbeat waking from a long slumber. They felt a subtle lift, as if Astrea herself believed she might become, for a breath, something more than a vessel of metal and crew, more like a conduit between human longing and the cosmos's quiet, indifferent patience. The approach to the ruin was slow, careful, designed to reveal as little as possible to a universe that might fling back something it did not mean to show a neighbor. They descended through a pale matter, a space where the nebula's glow disciplined itself to a pale breath, and the ship's hull resonated with the effect of that breath upon the metal. A landing came with a soft, imperceptible thump that was more a release than a landing. The ruin loomed ahead, a city of stone and glass grown to the size of a moon, but compact and deliberate, as if the builders had wanted their home to remain intimate rather than expansive. The towers glowed faintly, not with light, but with intention, as though each block of crystal held a memory that didn't yet have a language to express itself, but preferred light to explain what words failed to convey. The crew moved as one, a chain of bodies with a single, shared conviction. To pass the gate, you would need not just courage, but a memory strong enough to tilt the hinge. They strapped into their gear, checked their weapons, though their weapons were not meant to draw blood, but to keep the gate open long enough for their minds to step into its chamber, and stepped into the ruin's forecourt. The air changed the moment their boots connected with the crystalline ground. It was not cold or warm, but precise, a temperature that felt like a measurement and a sensation, a paradox that reminded them of how space could be both a blankness and a map at the same time. The ruin's square was a plaza of sorts, bordered by archways that rose into the air like the spines of great leviathans, their tips lost to a ceiling that was not there, only implied, a roof held up by a trust in geometry not often required by the ordinary laws of the world. In the center of the plaza stood a gate, or what passed for one, a circular opening framed by two rings of ruined stone that moved at a rate so slow as to be almost unnoticeable. Yet the effect was intoxicating, a slow-motion portal that promised a path to somewhere else, not a place, but a state of being that one could inhabit for the span of a breath, and perhaps long enough to learn what it meant to be a traveler in a cosmos that would not stop to explain itself. "Steady," Rhea said, though she did not mutter the word so much as let it pass through the group like a breath of wind that could either cool or burn depending on where you stood. "We move as one, we listen as one, we walk as one." They formed the semicircle around the gate, standing on its threshold, the air between the inner ring and their faces shimmering with heat like light that felt almost like anticipation rather than danger. The guardian figures, the ones who carried instruments, began to play, softly, their melodies not so much audible as felt, a vibration that traveled through their bodies and touched the ship's hull and the crew's minds at once. The gate's surface, a disk of living stone, began to rotate. Its movement was slow, deliberate, patient, like the turning of a door handle in a house that had waited a century for someone to turn it again. As the ripples traveled around the ring, the group felt a strange lifting sensation in their chests, a sense of releasing a long-held breath. Anaru, who stood closest to the gate, took a step forward, then paused, as if listening to a voice that existed only in the space between heartbeats. The voice was not spoken by any mouth in the ruin, nor by the ship's AI. It was a memory sent through the core of Astrea, a whisper of a truth that belonged to someone who had never lived in their world, but carried with them a map that could be used in any world. "Not all gates are for opening, Captain," the whisper said, a sound that felt like the rustle of pages in a library that did not exist in any physical form. "Some gates are for being walked through by those who know how to listen." Rhea nodded slightly. an action that seemed almost ceremonial within the circle of the crew. They all understood the message, even if none of them could yet fully articulate it. The gate required more than courage. It required memory, the ability to carry someone else's recall into a new place, to let the memory become a tool and not a trap. Enoru stepped onto the gate's threshold first. The air around him cooled in a way that did not feel like cold, but more like clarity, the kind of cool that clears away fog until you can see a thing's true shape. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, Astrea's hull trembled, as though the ship herself drew a breath in sympathy with his. Behind him, the others followed, Mira, Juno, Cicero's voice resonating softly through the ship's speakers, as if to remind them that the corridor of memory was not a solitary journey, but a chorus to be sung together. They moved as a single current, one step, then two, then three, and the gate gave way with a sigh that sounded more like a released memory than a mechanical door. The world beyond the gate did not arrive as a landscape, but as a memory spring, a corridor of light that bent and stretched into a space whose geometry obeyed its own rules. It was as if they stepped into a living stanza, a sentence that made sense only when spoken aloud by everyone present. They found themselves in a room that resembled a library, but the shelves were not shelves. They were the memories of civilizations, the languages of all the known and unseen worlds arranged in arcs that rose toward a ceiling that hummed with a soft, musical overture. The room was not filled with dust, but with the weight of what had once been thought and believed by species long since forgotten by the world that was their own. The Guardians were there again, but in a different pose. They stood around the room with their instruments, not as guardians now, but as conductors of an orchestra that did not play music so much as it summoned stories into being. The air vibrated with the memory of voices, the voices of people who spoke in patterns of sound that could bend the shape of reality, who believed that language was a force as real as gravity, and as deadly as a star going nova in a crowded city. In the center of the room, a pedestal held a single object, a stone shard, smooth and dark as a moonless night, and etched with the same runes that lined the gate. It was a memory of a time when a world attempted to tell its own history to the void, and was told back in a tongue that did not resemble human words. The shard thrummed with an energy that suggested it was more than a relic. It was a key carved from the night of a universe that had learned the art of speaking across many tongues, a language that had learned to become the world it described. Anaru approached the pedestal, his hand outstretched but not touching the shard yet. The shard glowed softly, as if recognition registered, not of his mind, but of his resolve. The Guardians moved closer to him, forming a protective circle around him without crowding him. A gesture that suggested the memory was not owned by any one person, but granted to those who proved worthy of carrying it. "We are not visitors," Rhea whispered, perhaps more to the world than to the crew. "We are readers of a text that is older than our own existence, and we intend to learn what it means to read it with care." Anaru's fingers hovered above the shard, then pressed lightly against the surface. The moment his skin made contact, the shard bloomed with light, a radiant pale blue that spread through his veins in a cold rush that felt almost like ice running through fire. A flood of images surged into his mind, ancient cities built from the same crystalline material as the gate, a procession of figures who wore the same light cloaks and carried musical instruments that sounded like his own childhood lullabies, and a map, a map, written not in ink or stone, but in the air itself, a gravity-defying topography that suggested a way to traverse not just space, but time. The memory did not belong solely to Anaru. It reached into everyone in the room, feeding them a shared sense of purpose and a reminder of what it felt like to be small against a world that remembered far more than any single individual could ever know. Rhea felt a weight settle on her chest, the sense of responsibility that came with knowing you might be allowed to walk through a door that held your life's work in its hinge. Mira felt the same weight in her hands, not a burden, but an invitation to become the kind of pilot who could guide a crew through memory's maze with a steady gaze and a steady heart. Juno felt a current of kinship with the Guardians, a recognition that the gate would not open to those who demanded it open, but to those who were willing to listen and become a part of the story the gate had chosen to tell. Sisera's voice came again, though now it carried a new, almost intimate tremor. Contingent access granted. You have demonstrated your willingness to carry memory without breaking under the pressure of it. Proceed with caution. They did proceed, stepping through memory after memory. Each memory a doorway, each doorway a decision. The corridors they moved through were like the inside of a mind, a labyrinth that did not present a map so much as a question. What would you do if you learned this about yourself? The voices of the civilizations who had lived in these memories spoke softly, telling their stories with a gentle insistence that demanded the crew listen to the longer arc of existence. In one memory, Mira saw a world where pilots trained not with machines but with language, where the way you described the wind around a ship could alter your trajectory through storms and anomalies. She listened to the language as it spiraled and changed, watched as the shapes of the words bent the very air, and allowed the ship to pass between two distant gravitational fields, as if they were nothing more than a narrow alley between two tall buildings back on Earth. A city she had never known but could now imagine with startling clarity. In another memory, Anaru watched a scholar who had learned to speak in a tone that could coax the very rocks to tell a story, rocks that remembered the memory of the planet's own birth. The scholar explained that to translate was not only to convert words from one tongue to another, but to render the world legible again for someone who would not otherwise see it. He felt that he was learning to become a translator of time itself, a person who could read the present by listening to what the past had chosen to reveal. Rhea interpreted the gate's test as an invitation to a test of moral gravity. The gate did not simply ask them to walk through. It asked them to choose what kind of travelers they would be in the future. The archive would reveal to them. And in the end, it was always a choice about responsibility. To carry forward the old world's memory, to hold it gently, to share it with their own counterparts, but never to weaponize it, to preserve it as a garden that could flourish rather than a weapon that could be aimed. Hours or perhaps days. The archive's sense of time was not something the crew could calibrate with certainty. Passed, and Estrella's crew moved through the corridor of memory, collecting fragments of a collective history that could fill their minds with a sense of obligation and awe. The gate's language began to shift from a series of decipherable symbols to a narrative, a story the archive was telling them about their own place in the cosmos, about how small creatures with bright eyes and stubborn hearts could become a part of something larger than their starship and even larger than their species. The climax of the segment arrived not with a single scream or a yawn of the universe, but with a low, almost humorous realization. They were not merely listening to the archive. They were becoming part of it. Their memories were seeping out of the compartments of their own minds and mingling with the ship's memory, becoming a new thread in the cosmos's tapestry, a thread that could be pulled from the weave to reveal the past more vividly than it had ever been seen before. When they finally stood back on their own, when the gate's corridor closed behind them with a sigh, the gate choosing to seal itself again, perhaps for reasons of safety, perhaps for reasons of mercy, the crew found themselves changed, a little closer to each other, a bit more akin to one another's thoughts, and more determined to meet the unknown with a courage that did not rely on weapons or bravado, but on attention, care, and memory. The ship's engines resumed their gentle thrumming, a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat through a chest of metal. The corridor remained behind their eyes, a memory they could almost glimpse again if they reached for it. And in the wake of the experience, the archive suggested a further path, a continuation of the journey toward a chamber even deeper within memory's labyrinth, a room that promised not only answers, but the truth about what those answers would do to them if they were ever to act on them. Rhea looked around at the crew, her face lit by the pale glow of the ship's instruments, her eyes reflecting a light that was both fear and wonder. She spoke, choosing each word with care, because words carried as much weight as anything they would lift in this strange, fragile voyage. "Remember this," she said, the words traveling through the cabin like a solemn breath. "The archive did not give us a map to a treasure. It gave us a map to our own capacity, to remember, to bear, to decide, to walk through the hinge without breaking the door. We have learned something new about the nature of language and the nature of ourselves. We carry it forward. We use it to become better guardians of the knowledge we have earned, and more careful with the knowledge we have yet to earn." The crew nodded in quiet agreement, a chorus of voices that did not shout, but kept a steady rhythm of assent. They prepared to depart the ruins' memory world, to return to Astrea's bridge, with the archive's gift tucked within them like a seed that would someday sprout into a new way of looking at the universe. As they prepared to retake the gate and step back into the corridor's light, a tremor ran through the ship, faint, almost a suggestion of something beyond the threshold of their understanding. It wasn't a threat so much as a test, a last reminder that there remained a boundary between memory and the present that even the archive could not remove by simply instructing them to step through. The chorus of guardians paused, their instruments lowering, their faces, if such they had, turning toward a point beyond the gate's memory-laden air. Then, almost at once, they dissolved into the light that framed the gate, becoming a part of the corridor's current and leaving behind a new sense of potential. "Something's coming," Juno said, not as worry, but as a practical observation, a captain's intuition that one more test would always be waiting beyond the door. Anaru looked to the shard in his hand, the same shard that had become their anchor to memory's corridor, and felt a resolve blossom within him. The shard's glow pulsed strong, a small sun in the darkness of memory's chamber, and he knew this was why they had come here. To learn how to endure not the volatile promise of discovery, but the quiet, stubborn responsibility of keeping a door open for others who might come after them. The memory world contracted and shifted, folding itself into a more manageable shape as they prepared to move. The gate's surface, its living stone, broke its own patient stillness, and within the split second of its return to stillness, Astrea's crew recognized the next road of their voyage. A corridor of light would lead them not to another ruin, but into a living archive of worlds that would demand their attention, their care, and their decision. The ship's sensors detected a change in the nebula's glow, a subtle, almost emotional brightness that suggested the cosmos itself might be watching. It did not feel angry or benevolent, just attentive, as if the universe was aware that someone had decided to look beyond the next planet's horizon for the first time in a long while. Rhea spoke again, a quiet, stubborn brightness in her voice. "Set a course for home, but do not avert your eyes from where the path leads. If we are to become a memory, let us become a memory that remembers well." Their course, in the absence of a true map, became a decision to move forward into the unknown with purpose, with restraint, and with the conviction that the archive's gift was not a treasure to be hoarded, but a responsibility to bear. Astrea's engines sang a careful hymn as they turned away from the ruins' memory world, back toward the cold, clear chorus of space. And as the ship slid back into the quiet, awash in the pale light of the nebula, and the unspoken promise of new corridors waiting beyond the hinge, the crew stood together, a small circle of living beings who had learned to listen not only to the stars, but to the memory that lay within them. The corridor's door had closed behind them, but a new door, the gate's door, had become part of them, a hinge in their own bodies and minds, a doorway they would carry wherever they went. They did not know what lay beyond the next memory sentence or the next corridor of light. They only knew that they would walk through it together, with the archive's blessing and the ship's steady, patient pulse beneath their feet. and with an awareness that the universe was a library and not a battlefield, a place of invitation rather than conquest, if one was brave enough to listen long enough to hear its quiet truth speaking through the geometry of the unknown. Continue prompt. They stepped through it, as they had promised themselves they would, shoulder to shoulder and breath to breath, the archive's blessing a soft wind wisp around their collars, the ship's slow, patient pulse beating beneath their feet like a distant drum that never forgot its rhythm. The threshold opened with a sigh of light that tasted of rain and old coins and the clean sting of ozone after a long dream. They crossed into a space that was not airspace, and not vacuum either, a corridor of listening light, where every particle hummed with memory, and every shadow carried a question. The geometry of the unknown hummed back at them in a language their bodies remembered long after their minds forgot the words. The universe breathed differently here, a library that did not merely store tomes, but also the footsteps of those who walked through it. Shelves rose on tendrils of radiant filaments, each filament humming with a biography of a sun, a planet, a decision once faced by civilizations that had neither collapsed nor conquered, but learned. The archive's presence inside their comms grew into a presence around them, a patient, almost paternal voice that carried warmth and weight in equal measure. "Do not rush," the archive whispered, though there was no need for words. The ship's hull, thick with experience and scars, kept its own pace, steady as a heartbeat, a reminder that momentum is a form of trust. They moved deeper, past shelves that bent like reeds in a river, past dioramas of star clusters arranged as if someone had tried to chart a map of every lesson the cosmos had ever offered, and had failed only because the map would always grow newer, truer, more honest with each watched dawn. The three of them, Captain Neris Hale, Navigator Kaya Rin, and Telemetry Archivist Juno Voss, stood in a clearing of light where the air tasted faintly of rain on stone, and the air itself carried a cadence, a measured syllable that did not belong to any language they had learned, but to their own shared humanity. The archive's blessing coiled around them like a ring of warmth that settled into their shoulders, quieting the war scratches in Kaya's memory and smoothing the stubborn lines in Juno's brow. Even Neris, who rarely allowed any emotion to show unless it was necessary to keep people alive, felt the soft ache of awe blooming in the center of her chest. "Here," Juno said finally, voice low, as if afraid the words would shatter the glass of this world if spoken too loudly. "We are listening." A constellation of pathways unfurled before them, each thread a route through a library of possibilities. Some paths were crisp as frost, others warm as the glow of a kettle on an alien hearth. Some threads braided into sentences that felt like lullabies, others cracked into questions that stung with truth. They moved as if following a map drawn, not on parchment, but on a child's palm, careful not to smudge the lines, because to break one meant to change something fundamental. The archive spoke now as a presence within the room, not just within their suits or their comms. It was not a voice to be obeyed, but a tutor to be consulted. Its guidance was not command, but invitation. Come closer to the seed of what is known, and you will learn how to plant it again in your own soil. The first illumination came as a door or perhaps a window, shaped like a dawn-lit thorn. It opened not outward, but inward, revealing a scene that did not happen here but everywhere. They saw themselves, not as they were now, but as they could become, if they chose to hear a certain truth, and not the louder truth that history often offers, when fear is louder than curiosity. In that vision, a war-torn world lay at the feet of a cosmos that had learned to shift its own gravity to protect its weaker lights. Ships drifted through the void like sailboats over a quiet, indifferent sea, their hulls bearing stories more fragile than their hulls were strong. The people spoke in a language that sounded like music when you listened with your heart, not your ears, an idiom of care that bound strangers into kin and forced machines to acknowledge the ethics of breath. Neris felt the weight of the vision land on her shoulders like a cloak she had not earned but could not cast away. The archive's blessing swelled around her, and she found herself listening not to commands, but to questions. The questions asked themselves in a chorus inside her mind. What would you do with this knowledge? How would you carry it back to a world that was too often deaf to the quiet truths of others? Which voice would you choose to speak for, and which one would you permit to sing for itself? Kaya, who always listened to the physics of things rather than the philosophies, heard a different texture in the corridor of light, a rhythm that sounded like a patient solar storm, a cadence that could guide them through a crisis without burning anything in its path. It was a reminder that to navigate the unknown well, you do not merely know the shapes of things. You know the timing of things, the exact moment when force becomes mercy, the precise length of a pause that can prevent a catastrophe, the geometry of a decision that keeps a crew alive, not only now, but in the generations to come. Juno, who had learned to map data streams to human beings, found a fraction of her fear turning into a seed of courage she could not identify, yet which felt good to hold. She recognized that the archive's blessing did not shield them from danger. It amplified the danger in a way that allowed them to meet it honestly, without the vanity of pretending it did not exist. The corridor of light contracted, then opened again, forming a circle of chairs carved out of the air. They realized they were not alone. Figures stepped from that circle, beings of shimmering intellect and kindness. They were not disembodied ghosts, but custodians of memory, historians of what civilizations chose to remember and how those choices shaped futures they had never lived to witness. The custodians bore the marks of their responsibilities. The lines around their eyes showed where constant listening had aged them, and the cadences of their voices bore the weight of countless conversations with worlds not their own. You have earned the right to speak with the archive, one of the custodians said, voice like wind through reeds, patient and even. But know this, the right is not a privilege. It is a duty to be carried back, not displayed here. Neris stepped forward, still feeling the glow of the blessing in her chest. We came seeking a way to end the hunger for conquest, she said, trying for steadiness, finding it easier than she anticipated. We want to learn how to share this knowledge without turning it into a weapon, without turning ourselves into weapons. The custodian inclined its head with a slow grace. Conquest begins as fear of scarcity, it said. If you listen to the library long enough, you will hear where scarcity ends and abundance begins. The archive gives you not a map, but a compass. It does not tell you which road to take. It shows you the direction in which you must walk to be true to what you have learned to be good. A soft murmur rose in the room, like a distant city waking after nightfall. The archive's presence softened, becoming a melody rather than a command. Its tone shifted to encourage, to remind them that the courage to change one's ways was the most delicate of all acts. They moved toward a chamber that pulsed with a warmth not of heat, but of reception. In its center floated a prism of light, a shard of reality that held within it a miniature cosmos, stars coalescing into a galaxy that spun with patient, unhurried wisdom. The shard did not demand attention. It offered invitation. It was the core of the library's truth, the reason the universe existed, as a repository of possibility, and not as a weapon of mass instruction. Kaya pressed a gloved hand to the window, and for a breath the room felt as if it had exhaled with her. The cosmos within the prism, open like a book in authoritative silence, showing moments of choice by civilizations that had learned to choose differently than the easiest path would have permitted. There was a group of people who refused to take what they needed from others, choosing instead to ask for permission, to bargain with fairness, to build a shared capacity, to repair what they had broken. And when the price of that choice was steep, perhaps the cost of fear, or the risk of appearing weak to rivals, their decision rippled outward like a stone thrown into a cosmic pond, shaping waves that would reach far beyond their lifetimes. The archive's blessing pulsed, a metronome aligning with the rhythm of those ripples. It spoke now in a voice that could feel like a memory rather than a command. A counselor who had walked through enough thresholds to know when a choice would echo through time in ways you could not foresee. What you must decide, it said, is not whether you will tell your own people about what you have seen, but how you will tell them. And how you will tell them is the hardest thing of all. You must tell them that the library does not belong to them alone, that it is a shared garden whose fruit must be tended with restraint, generosity, and a humility that is not weakness, but the strongest form of strength. Neris looked at the prism, as if peering into the glassy surface of a lake, and seeing not merely her reflection, but her future possibilities, the ship, the liminal. As the archive would recall it in quiet hours later, seemed to lean closer, listening with sensors open wider than any instrument had taught them to use. The crew felt a singular, deeper purpose press against their ribs, the sense that their voyage had never been only about reaching a distant truth, but about learning to become the kinds of people who would be worthy of living with that truth. The moment stretched, and in the stretch a voice like a quiet storm rose from beyond the chamber. Not loud, but unmistakably real. It was the first time they heard the library offer a vision of a homecoming that did not require everyone to forget what they had learned to be safe. The voice did not promise a utopia, only a possibility, a binding, not of chains, but of commitments, to carry what they had found back to the people who needed it most, to choose the right metaphor for teaching, rather than coercing the universe into their own image. "We will return with the truth you allow us to carry," Neris said, more to the cosmos than to the custodians. Her words surprised her, with their gravity, but she did not search for justification. She had learned here how to tell the truth to herself first. We will not claim it as ours. We will not hoard it as treasure. We will translate it into songs of plenty, not weapons of fear. The custodians nodded, an action that carried a weight of centuries behind it. The prism brightened, not with a blaze, but with a patient glow that felt like dawn over a quiet, patient sea. The archive's blessing intensified, not as a shield, but as a lantern, guiding them through a corridor of potential futures toward the one where their people would not merely survive, but learn to share what they had learned in ways that healed the old wounds of the universe, wherever they found them. Then, the Chamber of Echoes, the final threshold, welcomed them via a door that opened not with force, but with invitation. They stepped through into a hall of memory where every line of light was a chorus of voices from worlds they could only imagine. Some voices spoke with the tremor of a child's insight, others with the gravity of a teacher who had spent a lifetime shaping minds. The archive's presence rode the air as if it carried the scent of rain on a distant world, a reminder that knowledge without compassion is a rumor, and compassion without knowledge is a ship without a map. In the center of the hall, a balcony hung over a space that was as much a memory as a place. There the three of them faced a gull-wing silhouette, the figure of an older, wiser version of themselves, formed by the light of the library's radiant lines. It spoke not in words, but in a resonance that filled their chests and opened their throats for a moment of unguarded honesty. "We have walked with you through the threshold," the figure said, and the words sounded in their ears as if spoken by someone who knew their dreams and their failings in equal measure. "We have watched you resist the arrogance of conquest and choose instead the hard, slower mercy of listening. You will take this back as a living instrument, not a weapon, not a symbol of triumph, but a reminder that truth is a practice." The vision shifted, becoming a map in which each star they had ever known flickered like a bead of fire along a thread. They saw their own world in the distances, a planet dotted with cities that could become the libraries of their own collective wisdom if they chose to lay down their weapons and cultivate dialogue. They saw their crew, not as a team bound for a single mission, but as a chorus, each voice necessary, each fault line a conversation that could become a bridge rather than a fracture. The archive's blessing intensified, and with it came a sense of responsibility more weighty than any cargo they had ever carried. It was not a burden, but a direction, a path carved in the air by a patient will that wanted nothing more than to see life flow toward more luminous futures. The custodians nodded again, their faces softening into expressions of hopeful resolve. They were not offering a guarantee of peace, nor a negligence-free voyage. They offered a covenant to return with the truth as a discipline, to practice restraint as a discipline, to teach with generosity rather than coercion, and to listen with more than their ears because listening was the only honest way to know when to speak. The door creaked and sighed as it opened outward, a sound that felt like the opening of a slow dawn. The ship's lights changed. The ship's hull took in a breath of shared purpose. The three of them stood a moment longer while the chamber's light pooled at their feet, a soft sheen of gold that seemed to settle into their skins, making their nerves hum with a new tenderness. The archive's voice lowered to a level that was almost a whisper, a confidant's cadence that did not demand attention but asked for it with a gentle insistence. "You have the keys now," it said, not as a boast but as a quiet reminder. "But the doors you open will become doors for others. You must carry with you the discipline to guard what you have learned, not only for your own survival, but for the survival of all those who will never know your names, or your ships, or your language, yet will be shaped by the echoes you leave behind." Neris walked toward the door that led back toward the ship, the prism still glowing in the palm of her memory, a small sun inside her chest that she did not know how to name, but knew how to guard. Kaya followed, feeling the intimate currents of the library's truth, rearranging not only her thinking, but the memory of her own past, the way she had learned to distrust the quiet, the way she had learned to fear the silence that follows a failed plan. Juno, last to step through the threshold with the archive's blessing shimmering around her like heat on a summer horizon, felt a new cadence ring through her bones, the cadence of responsibility, not burden, as though a long voyage had settled into a rhythm she could recognize, a rhythm that would keep time with the breath of any new world they might visit. In the corridors behind them, the custodians offered no gestures of farewell, only the promise that if they listened well enough, if they returned with humility and courage, the library would keep its door ajar. The ship's approach through the veil of the threshold was not abrupt, but careful, a patient re-entry that matched the pace of the new understanding now guiding them. The liminal's hull drew near the edge of the known cosmos, not to claim territory or extract wealth, but to begin the slow, precise work of translation, mediation, and stewardship. The archive's blessing persisted like a soft, subcutaneous glow that reminded them to speak gently, to listen before replying, to measure their words as if each syllable could sculpt a future for those who could not yet imagine it. The stars began to settle into familiar patterns as the ship slowed, settling into a course that would take them home with the knowledge of a better way to be in the universe. They moved through the quiet space that lay between knowing and believing, the place where courage is made from the simple act of choosing to keep listening, even when the voice of fear whispers its own version of the truth. On the bridge, the main screen flickered to a map neither fully new nor entirely old, a composite of what they had known before and what they had learned to imagine. The archive's glow threaded through the console's lines like a careful seam, stitching new possibilities into the fabric of the ship's routine. The crew found themselves falling into a cadence they did not have to force, a rhythm that allowed them to act with restraint and with hope at once. "We owe it to them, ourselves, and everyone who will come after, to keep this quiet vow," Kaya whispered, not pleading, simply stating a fact that had become a moral compass. In the moment they realized the library's truth was not a gift to be received and then shelved away, but a practice to be learned and lived. Neris nodded, not with the weight of exhaustion, but with the lightness of a decision made again and again, until it became second nature. She peered toward the starfield, toward the faint spiral of a system that hummed with a different kind of life, a life that thrived on conversation rather than conquest. The deck's permanent hum, a reminder of the ship's steady, patient pulse, seemed to answer with a deeper resonance, as if the vessel itself approved of their new covenant with the cosmos. The archive's final presence felt less like a guide and more like a partner who would stay with them, a quiet force that would help keep their hands clean of any temptation to hoard knowledge, to exploit vulnerability for leverage, or to pretend that mercy was a luxury they could ill afford. It did not vanish, though its voice softened to a practical whisper that could be heard most clearly in the moments of doubt, when a choice threatened to revert to old, familiar patterns. "You will face trials," the archive reminded them in a tone that carried both caution and belief. Not trials of danger alone, but trials of stewardship, the test of whether your ship and your people can endure the quiet, patient work of building rather than breaking. When you falter, listen for the library's echo. It will be there, a line of light you can follow back to the right rhythm. The ship's systems sang with a renewed sense of purpose. The crew's eyes met, as if sharing a single new map of the universe. A map drawn not with lines of conquest, but with the careful arcs of learning. They did not know what lay ahead in detail. The precise shape of the next conflict, the intricacies of diplomacy, the silent tremors of fear that could still rise in frightened hearts. They did know they would face it together, with the archive's blessing, and the ship's steady, patient pulse beneath their feet, and with an awareness that the universe was a library and not a battlefield, a place of invitation rather than conquest. If one was brave enough to listen long enough to hear its quiet truth speaking through the geometry of the unknown. And when the first signals of home breath and light and the soft warmth of atmosphere touched their screens, they did not flinch or turn away. They breathed with it, letting it teach them the art of coming back differently, not as heroes of a story built on scars and triumphs, but as caretakers of a delicate truth. That knowledge, when shared with care and consent, can heal more than it wounds, can bind more than it breaks, can widen the circle of what future generations believe possible. The planet's blue glass atmosphere rose in the distance, like the face of a patient tutor, patient with their mistakes, and generous with the lessons learned in the quiet corridors of a library that spoke in light. The archive's gentle glow pressed into their bones as they prepared to land, and for the first time since their ascent from fear, they felt the faintest, surest thing settle in their chests: hope, not as a naivete, but as a practiced discipline, a tool they could use in the real world with the same care they used to translate the cosmos' deepest truths into whispers of mercy. They landed, the doors opened, not with the triumph of victory, but with the dignity of conscientious arrival. The crowd that gathered did not roar or hurl praise, but watched with the cautious reverence reserved for those who have touched a thing sacred and returned to tell the tale without breaking its spine. The archive's blessing settled over the planet as a soft rain of light that did not wash away the old wounds, but offered a new way to tend them, a language in which even the loudest voices could learn to listen. In the days that followed, the crew began to share what they had learned, not as a sermon, but as a curriculum of restraint. How to speak with other civilizations about their histories without converting their stories into weapons. How to propose shared guardianship of knowledge and memory as a political act of the most practical kind. How to treat fear not as a foe to be vanquished, but as a signal to pause, to reflect, to ask a better question. And the archive remained a constant, patient presence within the ship's central chamber, where data and breath mingled, and the math of memory grew gentler with each passing hour. It did not force memory into obedience. It offered itself as a guide, a companion on the long walk back toward a future where the cosmos was not something to be conquered, but something to be read with care. If you listened long enough, you could hear the quiet truth speaking through the geometry of the unknown, not as a speech that commands, but as a melody that invites, a chorus that asks for participation rather than acquiescence. The universe, in its overarching librariness, did not demand worship. It asked for stewardship, for a balance between wonder and restraint, for a courage that chose to translate and share rather than to take. And so the three of them, Neris, Kaya, Juno, began to live inside the library's truth, the way a reader lives inside a book after the last page has been turned. carrying the resonance of the story within them, as if it were a small, permanent star. They walked the planet's streets and the hallways of its councils, with the same careful steps they had learned in that distant corridor of light. They spoke less and listened more. They asked for permission before presenting ideas. They offered to translate fear into questions that could be discussed. They refused to pretend that every problem could be solved by force, choosing instead to demonstrate that even the oldest enemies could become partners when listened to with the patience that the archive's blessing demanded. In the classrooms, in the market squares, in the quiet rooms where elders told tales to the young, the imprint of their journey showed in the way people spoke of knowledge, no longer as a trophy to display, but as a living resource to protect and to share with those who did not yet understand its worth. The library's truth did not leave them, it settled into their bones, and every new decision they faced was colored by the memory of that threshold, that circle of light, that invitation to walk with care and to listen for the quiet truth beneath every loud claim. And in the hours between duties, when the ship's engine slept and the stars outside looked down as patient as the universe itself, they would find themselves listening, truly listening, for a whisper in the geometry of the unknown, for a hint of a path that would keep them on the right side of that vow they had made, to themselves and to each other, and to all those who would one day call this voyage a beginning rather than a memory. Because the universe was a library, after all, and if you listened long enough, it would teach you the way to walk through it with your hands open and your heart steady, always letting the memory of its quiet truth speak through you. Even when the night grew loud with fear and doubt, they listened, they learned, they returned. And in that returning, perhaps the cosmos found its answer to a question that had never truly ceased, that the only conquest worth pursuing is the conquest of fear, by the patient art of listening. The only victory worth celebrating is the victory of a civilization that can tell its own stories without tearing others apart. And the only lasting light is the one that shines when those who have learned how to walk through the unknown with kindness teach others to do the same.